Broadcasting live from the depths of an evil mind, this is the Monstrous Feminine Podcast, the film club where we dissect the eerie intersections of gender and horror. My name is Louisa, and I'm joined by my devils,
Mila,
Tyia,
and Zeba.
And this is our next episode on our serial killer theme. We will be covering the 2010 Korean action thriller I Saw the Devil, directed by Kim Jee-woon. Before we get into the film, go ahead and follow us on Spotify, YouTube, or the Apple Podcasts app. You can find all of our links on our Instagram at the Monstrous Feminine Podcast.
I Saw the Devil follows a violent cat and mouse chase between Kim Soo-hyun, an NIS officer and brutal rapist and serial killer Jang Kyung-chol after he murders and dismembers Soo-hyun's fiancée, Jang Joo-yeon. Soo-hyun, maddened with rage and determined in his vengeance, hunts down Kyung-chol to deliver him the justice he deserves, but soon discovers to catch evil, one must do evil.
네가 나한테 얻을 수 있는가? 아무것도 없어. 그러니까 난 이미 졌어. 알아? 난 네가 죽은 후에도 고통스러웠으면 좋겠다.
So back in our first episode, we talked about our initial experiences with horror, early memory, traumatizing scenes, and I'm curious if you have a similar kind of experience with serial killers, whether it's like true crime documentaries. I guess it could still be a horror film.
I remember learning about Eileen Wuornos at a really young age. Do you remember her? She would cut off their dicks. That was her thing. I don't know. I remember her being like an on-the-road kind of serial killer. I don't know if she would always kill them, but she would cut their dicks off. And she's one of the only women serial killers. Like, there are very few women serial killers, and she is one of the most prolific. And I learned about her because people would make jokes on sitcoms and stuff. They'd be like, oh, she's gonna be like Eileen Wuornos, like if she was like a man-hating bitch who was gonna cut your dick off. Like it was like a thing in media for a long time. But yeah, I thought about that lady a lot when I was younger, because I guess they just like brought her up and I Googled her. Just like my early memories of like, that's a name of a serial killer I used to hear a lot, but in a joke. It was always a joke. Like no one was ever talking about her like in seriousness. It was just so funny that she cut dicks off.
I also remember her only in conversations about the film and only in terms of Charlize Theron's transformation for the role. Like that's the only memory I have in terms of its presence in pop culture was, wow, look at this hot chick turn into disgusting misandrist psycho. Like that, I just remember that being such a big deal, which is, I mean, it's very telling.
I remember the case of Eileen Wuornos as well. Like there was sexual assault involved. Like she had a sad history with it, and that I think some of her victims actually did try, or so she claimed, to sexually assault her. I can't find evidence that Eileen Wuornos cut people's penises off.
Wow, did they just say that about her? Maybe I made that shit up. I remember there being jokes about it.
I feel like it would be sensationalized into shit like that, though.
Kind of apt that the media interpretation would be that she was a castrator, because all I'm seeing is that she shot her victims. So I'm not, I mean, maybe there's more detail. I have not watched the documentary or the movie or anything, so I don't know.
Like serial killer, I don't know, maybe Ted Bundy, because Florida is so close to where I was growing up that it was mentioned a lot. But other than that, my mom watched a lot of true crime stuff, so I would hear about it, and I was conscious that it was a thing, but I don't think I knew many serial killers by name until maybe I was in high school, and I started watching more true crime documentaries and reading about things, and took AP Psych, and we had a unit on criminal psychology. I don't know. I don't think I had a huge fascination when I was younger, and I definitely don't now. So
I don't remember my first experience of a serial killer. I just remember I was obsessed. I do really like currently as well, Criminal Minds. I love that propaganda, man. Like, yeah, my childhood show, not childhood, that's too young, but my tween show for real is Criminal Minds. The one man I remain attracted to is Matthew Gray Gubler, who plays Dr. Spencer Reed. Yeah, that's my like exposure to serial killers, is I guess just being obsessed and watching Criminal Minds with my mom.
I do remember, this isn't, I mean, I guess it's formative years, but not like early. When we were in English class, we did Caroline Duffy's poetry, and one of, I think it's called The World's Wife. And she was writing from the perspective of different like female historical figures. And one of them was, it was called like The Devil's Wife. And it was about a UK, I mean, it was a pair of serial killers. Her name was something Hindley, but she was essentially an accomplice to child murders. I think they're called the Moors murders. And obviously, like, a lot of the media coverage was about like just disbelief at a woman being able to commit such evil. And it's just, yeah, notable that we're remembering the female serial killers from our like growing up, whether it's in the news or pop culture. But like anytime a woman commits these similar acts of evil, like it's just, it seems unthinkable, which this isn't meant to be some weird like, hey, women can kill too pep talk, but I just mean that it obviously sticks with us more.
I know exactly what you're talking about, and I think this one, it's Ian Brady and Myra Hindley, and I think this one's particularly insidious because it was also killing children, and that was like particularly heinous for a woman to do, because it's like, how could you not be maternal, not only not be maternal but also kill children? But I also feel like this is just one of those cases where it's like, well, you know, sexism harms everyone because you overlook that women can be perpetrators if we're always associating subconsciously as a society like with women with maternal or innocence.
The Monstrous Feminine is on YouTube, so please go subscribe and leave us a comment on one of our videos. If you do engage with our content, you might just get a shout out in our next episode as our Witch of the Week. This episode, our Witch of the Week is Vivi, who commented on our Gone Girl episode and said, I love y'all. My Roman Empire or my Gone Girl is Girl Interrupted. If you guys ever do Girl Interrupted with a Lisa Rowe focus, I will be seated. Keep up the good work.
My God, I would love to do Girl Interrupted. How can we? I mean, it's not it's not horror, not even close. So it's gonna be tricky for us to try to get to do that one. We've definitely done like films that aren't strictly horror. This one included I Saw the Devil, but Girl Interrupted, while certainly being a really excellent like exploration of like female psychopathy and female mental health, it's gonna be hard to make it. But I do love that film and would love to talk about it.
I really like Girl Interrupted too. So we will definitely put it on the list and try to figure out a way to have it on the podcast. But I think Vivi is a great username. It's very adorable. And I hope that you have a happy fall and you have lots of great treats given to you at Halloween and everything goes great for you and you have a wonderful rest of 2024.
Friendly reminder that we're also on Patreon and Substack. You can find all of our links and our information on our social media. Please support us. Any contribution helps.
Okay, so this film, so I've seen it before a while ago. This is one of our films that we put to our Patreon pledges to vote for, but I was scared that they might pick this, and they did in fact pick this film, and I was like, I'm too scared to rewatch it, because usually if I've seen the film before a while ago, I'll go and rewatch it, but I was like, you know what, guys, I just can't subject myself to that. In my fragile mental state, I can't do it. We've already done a very classic, we've done a few classic American serial killers in our depiction, which is kind of part of the reason why we don't really have that as an option in our serial killer theme. And you should go listen to our episodes on like Halloween or Silence of the Lambs. But I think we have that kind of like classic, like this is a depraved human serial killer covered in other episodes. Whereas like this one's a bit more interesting because we've got a sort of duality between killer and say detective or law enforcement agent. It's just toying on that classic Nietzsche quote of like, oh, if you want to catch a monster, you have to become a monster. So I think this is an interesting one to do for serial killers because I don't think the boundaries between right or wrong are as they're definitely not fixed. They're very permeable in this film.
I agree that this movie is very scary, not even for like the gore factor or the, I don't know, explicitness or creativity of the kills. I mean, there's so many horror movies where women are the victims. I would maybe even say like the majority are like incorporate women being brutalized or terrorized in some way. Something about, I guess, the setup of this killer is that he's just like so relentless. Both the killer and I guess he's a detective, are like really single-minded and relentless in their goals, whether it be the goal to kill as many women or people as possible, even when laying low would be the more reasonable thing to do. And then the other relentlessness comes from this like revenge plot thing. And I think a lot of serial killer movies center a detective or an investigator as the protagonist, and like Louisa said, in the other American serial killer movies that we've covered, or even non-American ones, there's some element of investigation that's like the interesting piece of it, or like finding clues. This was not even really that. I think the pacing of a revenge movie is really consistent for me, and this threw it all the way off. Like he basically finds the guy 20 minutes into the movie, and then it just keeps going. Like he keeps letting him go. At some point I just found it like very exhausting. Like it one in the violence, but also like two in the, like my frustration with the psychology of these characters was that like both of you should stop. Like there's no need for the killer to keep killing, and there's no need for like you to keep letting him go. And I think because the revenge could have been taken care of so early in the movie, I really had a hard time. Like I struggled with the motivation of both of them. Like sometimes I'm like, insanity can't be enough. Like trauma can't be enough for it to be happening in this way. And I just couldn't imagine what the next thing would be, or the next innocent person who would get caught in the middle of this cat and mouse chase, like how they would be involved. Like I found it very like morally frustrating to watch, I think.
Yeah, morally frustrating is a good is like a very understated like reaction, I'd say.
Yeah, but the kills were very cool. That stuff was creative, and some of it reminded me a little bit of like Saw, like the contraptions or like the ways that he kills them or whatever. Like that's always fun to me as a horror fan, but I felt like a rag being wrung out by the end of it.
As you guys already know, I had delayed me watching this film for a while because I just knew I had to be very engaged. I knew I had to like not shy away from this film. And I knew obviously of its like brutal violence and content. And I just like simply was procrastinating that forever. But no, I'm glad I watched it, obviously. And I did watch it like like an undesirable hour to watch this kind of film. I finished it at 2:30 a.m. and here in London we had like a crazy storm, and it was like it literally started like pissing it down as I was finishing like the last few scenes, and then thunder and lightning, and it was just like it was a lot emotionally. Honestly, it was like pathetic fallacy in real life, truly. And obviously I understand like what did you say, the moral frustration with having to confront a film like this. I'm not sure if I felt it maybe to the extremes that you guys are feeling it. That sort of, for me, obviously the violence was like stomach churning. However, I think the like content of its violence and also the central psychopathic serial killer, like their psychology, I'm not saying like that they get into the psychology a lot of him, but just like the deep rooted misogyny of that character, I thought it was like a really, not to say accurate, but I think a very poignant portrayal of like violence, and that it obviously, we will talk about like revenge and how it will like you to confront the devil, you have to become the devil. Like obviously there's a lot of that like very cyclical thematic kind of shit going on. But I do think that this is a film that clearly had like such a clear intention with how it was going to portray violence. And in the end, I think has enough of like an emotional depth to it that to be honest, I didn't see any sort of like moral disgust with what it was presenting as on screen, just like in and of itself. Like obviously I was disgusted with what it was portraying, but I wasn't thinking this shouldn't be portrayed or do you know what I mean?
I wasn't saying that like I like morally objected to what was on the screen. I was frustrated with the characters' decisions. I was like, nobody's making moral decisions.
That's very true. Like I feel like undeniable sadness for our central, like for, I'm not sure of his name, but the like fiance, like undeniable sadness. And I think he's such a brilliant actor and like evoked that his like inner turmoil so well. But I think in general, it's exactly what I was expecting, because obviously I told you guys like the one film that I have felt, actually there's two films that have like really confronted me with being so squirming, want to get out, don't want to watch anymore, in terms of horror / thrillers. And it's Hereditary, that car scene, and then Zodiac, like a particular violent scene in Zodiac. And then I like went on Wikipedia before I saw The Devil, and it said like that the director had taken great inspiration from Fincher's Zodiac. And I was like, fucking hell, like I'm so scared to watch this. Having said that, I think that it didn't quite have the same effect, but it did like gut punch me emotionally. And also like some of the violence was like, I wanted to be sick, obviously. That was horrific. But I'm just like, comparing like what I was going into, like expecting, obviously like you build up anticipation in your head. I finished it and I was blown away. I thought it was like, I know this seems like a strange word to choose, but I think it's a beautiful film. Like really like brutal and like gut-wrenching, but like very beautifully made, and obviously made with like a very clear purpose.
I've seen this film a lot of times in the least weird way possible, but this used to be like a film that I would put on to like any friend who said that they wanted to get into Korean cinema.
Damn, that's your first film?
What
Ease them
happened with
in.
easing in? Like,
If they said that they were into like Korean cinema or they wanted to try, then I would be like, oh, okay, like what genres are you into? And if they said thriller or horror action, I would always be like, okay, let's watch this film. People always really enjoy this film. I think it's really well done. The action sequences and the cat and mouse is immaculate. And I think it really keeps the energy of the film up the whole time, because it is very long for like a revenge horror-ish film. It's still kind of long, and I do think at some point you kind of get like exhausted with how often he lets him go, mainly because so many people get hurt in the process every time. There's the final murders that kind of, I guess, put him over the edge of Soo-hyun's sister and her father, that really sort of push it over the edge of this is went from a tragedy that he could have, I guess, enacted revenge on early in the film to wiping out an entire family, because he continued so far to like toy with Kyung-chul.
not Soo-hyun's sister, but his fiance's late fiance's sister.
And her father. They both die in the crossfire of this. You're very exhausted with him by the end of the movie because his choices are inherently selfish. At some point, I think his revenge stops being a quest for justice and more so the punishment that he thinks Kyung-chul deserves for what he has done, and how what he has done has affected Soo-hyun's life personally. It's not necessarily about the act or getting justice for it, even though he comes from a background so connected to justice, and she of course was a police chief's daughter, his fiance. There's all these like connections to justice and getting it over with and turning him over to the authorities, but he really resists that the entire movie. And it shifts to being about his fiance to being about their personal relationship with each other and the hatred they have for each other and how they punish each other. Because deep down, Kyung-chul does know if he continues to kill every time, Soo-hyun is going to show up. They're going to have a battle it out, but he also is going to sort of feed his perverse urges.
The sheer numbers of women, like at that point I was so terrorized by this man. I'm like, not 6 or 7, like please, I beg. That's what it started to be like. a bit too much.
Yeah, it's just like the access that he had to women, and especially because I think one of the interesting things in this is that in multiple instances, Hyung Chol puts himself as a figure of sort of trust that you would naturally just sort of not necessarily have your flags raised by. Like maybe you think a bus driver is creepy, maybe you think the person who comes to repair your car is creepy when you call. But like you know that like okay, they're just here to fix the car, so you're not going to be alarmed. So he places himself in these positions in which people are vulnerable, but they also are like their guard is let down because they think this person is here to help me or they're here to perform a service. And that's how he gets multiple victims, especially two of the most quote unquote innocent victims. When he takes Soo-hyun's fiance and when he abducts her and kills her, she's wearing like a pure white coat. And that's one of the only sort of pure white outfits in the film. And the schoolgirl is obviously wearing her uniform, which is very predominantly white as well. So I thought that was terrifying that he was able to get himself into these situations, but also on a, I guess, broader note, it is sort of a scary reminder to how it's very hard to trust anyone, especially if you're alone as a woman. Like any person, whether they're there to perform a service, whether they're in a position where they're supposed to help you, can be turned into someone who is a source of danger. Because she sort of waves it off even when she's on the phone with Soo-hyun and she's like, oh, like it's just the repair guy, he's like moving around outside, like don't worry about it, until he attacks her. So I think that sort of awareness of anyone in any position, especially where your guard is down and you're in a vulnerable situation, can become a huge source of danger. Yeah, I think the chase in the film sort of shifts from being like a moral and just one to just like a selfish relationship between the two of them that's almost sadistic.
Yeah, there was a really interesting. I read a couple of interviews because I was like, I need to get in this guy's head. With the director, Kim Jee-woon. And there was an interview with Pamela John for Electric Sheep, and goes on to talk about how this is. He says, of course, Soon-hyun wants the killer to feel the pain that he feels, but he actually dreams of ultimate revenge. So in that sense, it is a very narcissistic kind of revenge. But at one point in the process, he becomes dangerously obsessive, and soon he starts making mistakes, and he also abuses others along the way. This is shown as most extreme in the last act of revenge and the way he inflicts pain on others. It was just kind of what you were saying, Tyia, about like that's it becomes selfish. Narcissistic is definitely what I got, and I think that's where also I had the same feelings as you, Zeba, where it's like the kind of moral frustration is more about like his kind of hubris, like his like pride in like catching him, letting him go. And it's like you could have spared like all these other victims in the latter half of the film, like as we go on throughout the film, if you had just like stopped focusing on how to punish this man in the most like torturous way and just like, you know, caught him and like arrest, you know what I mean? Like you could have put an end to it. So in that way, I can see that like this like narcissistic element to it.
I also think he fundamentally misunderstands the psychology of the killer, because when he gets him in his final trap, he's like, oh, I want you to like beg in fear, like, you know, presumably like his wife did. And that is the thing that is going to satisfy him. But like the man is not afraid of dying, I don't think. Like he's at the end sort of like, I think, doing a reverse psychology moment and begging for him to kill him. Or actually, no, he's begging for him to not kill him. He switches it up at some point, and like maybe he thinks that will entice the guy to just end it. And while obviously he is being physically tortured, like his wife and this man do not have the same mentality. The fear his wife was feeling pregnant in the hands of a killer, like the killer is never going to feel that exact emotion. So he was never going to be satisfied. And so interesting that you're saying narcissism now, because I see that now, but I initially saw it as like, oh, you're like fundamentally like misunderstanding the emotions of a psychopath. Like it's just not going to you're never going to get the conclusion that you want, essentially.
I'm not sure if I'd really describe it as a narcissism, because I think he's obviously sort of blinded by like unimaginable grief. And I think that like inability to really understand that this man does not possess the same empathy and conscience that we like understand. We have a collective understanding that humans all share. I think that regardless of whether you have like an under like a sort of like theoretical grasp that like serial killers exist, I think it's a totally other thing to be confronted with it again and again. Like I just don't think that's something people are like able to wrap their heads around, and I'm sure that like feeds into him basically again and again, like searching for this sense of justice for himself and for his fiance, that it really can't be fulfilled because he can't enact the same psychological pain onto the serial killer. Sure, he attempts like physical pain. There's a completely like separate dimension to suffering that is like spiritual and psychological pain. And I think he's really trying to tap into that. And he can only do that from his own frame of reference, which is like in his connections to the people he loves, like them being tortured and killed. He's like going at it from like the wrong approach. This isn't criticisms of his how he's like conducting his revenge. I think the film is just trying to show like the utter tragedy of that. He works in, I mean, I guess like a facet of law enforcement and like intelligence. He clearly both believes and understands legal justice. I don't know. I just think that it wouldn't be enough for you on a sort of like that deep spiritual, emotional level. Like that's clearly not enough. But also he could never get what he wants, I suppose. And that's like the whole sort of tragedy of like violence for what sake? Because even if he had turned around and said, I'm fucking scared, or it depends like how you read the final scene, like is he ashamed for his family to come in and see him, or is he just fucking terrified about the door opening and cutting his head off? Like I'm not really sure. Even if he had turned around and said like, you know what, I'm fucking shit scared, then what? Like there's always that in revenge plots, like, and then what? Like this has made no tangible effect on my life. It's not brought this person back. It has not healed me in any way. The film is like showing the sort of injustice of that's like unavoidable, basically.
I definitely see what you're saying, but I do disagree that he's not displaying some like selfishness and maybe even narcissism in his decision making, because I think when we have the encounter where he saves sort of the schoolgirl and he beats him up and then lets him go immediately, Kyung-chul kills 2 people, sexually assaults a nurse. He shows back up and they have another fight. He interacts with, after Kyung-chul goes to his cannibal friend's house and they sort of figure out who Soo-hyun is and his connection to Kyung-chul and why he's obsessed with him. They have another showdown in which it leads to the cannibal and his girlfriend getting arrested and going to the hospital. And honestly, I think at that point we start to realize that he knows that the right thing to do is to just let him be arrested. The case is solved. He knows who the serial killer is, but he's rather continue to torture him and let him go so that he can have sort of this like figure out what would be the worst ending for him possible and what would make him feel the best, instead of how can I prevent more people from dying? Because every time he lets him go, he goes off and kills more people, or he sexually assaults a woman. And those people are basically being used as collateral for his emotional damage. And he has a lot of trauma because what he went through is really horrible. But there's so many people in the process who just keep getting murdered, killed, sexually assaulted, beat down in the process of their game going back and forth. And sure, maybe Soo-hyun shows up in the throw of things to save them, but often he doesn't. He shows up after it's happened or after they have already been sexually assaulted. So the damage is done. So, okay, he gets his 5 minutes, he cuts him, he beats him down, and then lets him go and says, I'm coming back for you next time, bitch. And then in the final showdown, he has his parents come in and we know it's going to decapitate him, but he's passed his trauma along to Kyung-chul's elderly parents and his son, who he'd already abandoned. So they already had trauma from this man, but he's given them even more. And I mean, I think his crying is maybe the crying of him at the end is sort of realizing that, and it's not like a sense of relief. But I definitely think while Kyung-chul is very obviously evil and the clear devil in this movie, Soo-hyun's not innocent by any means. He definitely becomes evil in the process of this because knowing how he feels, he still wanted to make other people feel that pain just because he wanted to feel like he ultimately got back at Kyung-chul in the worst way possible. But ultimately, he had a pretty quick death, and his son and his family have to live with the rest of their life seeing him murdered before their eyes, which is arguably a much worse fate. While he gets a quick death, he didn't go to prison. He didn't have to think about what he did for very long because his thoughts were mainly occupied with, like, what can I do before this man shows up and we fight again? Like, he's not really sitting around thinking about what he's done. He's not regretting anything. And I don't really think he's cares about his family seeing him for what he is at the end. I think he's just more angry that this is how he dies. I think he wanted to go out in a more interesting way.
I think I agree with like kind of most of that. I think two things can be true. I think this can be a really like poignant commentary on like grief and the torture of grief. But I also think there is just some complacency to him in like repeatedly letting him go. I do think you see him have a moral compass. Like I don't think he's as evil, for example, as the serial killer, but I do think that there is something like grief can be so all subsuming that maybe like you can't really see. It's not necessarily logical, and he can't see that like what he's doing might lead to more harm. Like I guess the point that I saw for me where he became like Soo-hyun came more like irredeemable is when his fiance's dad and sister die as a result of like him playing this game and like trying to find the worst. Like he ends up like getting his now late fiance's family killed because of his own kind of complacency that he could always catch him before he commits crime. And I think at this point he should know better, and he totally underestimates his opponent, because I agree with you, Zeba, he does completely like misunderstand the psychopathy of like a person like this. But anyway, so I do think that there is a kind of narcissism in his grief there. But I do think more should be said about the grief point, because I actually think there are quite a lot of like reviews which just call this film like exploitative, and there's comments on like the poor characterization. Nick Schrager for Slant Magazine says it's just hypocritical exploitation. He calls like the violence like increasingly numbing nasties, and essentially he doesn't think the film lands. And Elizabeth Kerr for The Hollywood Reporter also talks about like this film being offensive and women have no role other than to be brutalized, and the film loses sight of its point in order to wallow in its own lurid violence. And another critic, Ryan Lambie for Den of Geek, said that though the kind of serial killer character seems fleshed out, Soo-hyun is a, quote, thin and underwritten character, and even an athletic sad-eyed performance from Lee Byung-hun fails to give him much more depth. So people are quite negative about like it and like what the violence is doing and the characterization. I actually disagree with that, because I agree more with what you were saying, Mila, that there is this kind of profound like sadness that is with the kind of grief that's being explored. And there was this reviewer, Mark Olson for the LA Times, who talks about how there's this undercurrent of real emotion and how unrelentingly sad all this violence can be. So I think that there is depth to it, and it's why I'm not offended at what the film's doing personally, even though I said at the beginning of this episode that I find it really, really difficult to watch. I do agree that like there's a purpose to this, and I think there is this kind of sadness and grief is being explored in a way that's quite interesting, even as it leads to him, you know, doing very similar things as the devil in question.
Yeah, I can obviously understand like criticisms of this film, because I think it's never very black and white between what makes like justified violence, not like in the philosophical sense. I mean, I guess that too, but like for on-screen violence, like what is justified, what is purposeful, what is too far, like those conversations are like difficult, and there's never really a clear answer. But I do think it's important to like contextualize Korean cinema on like the global stage, just in terms of how it's received, especially because, I mean, talking about like Old Boy is another like very well established example of extreme Korean cinema, and like that word extreme is like it's very married towards like Korean horror and action thrillers, and that's because like the term Asia Extreme was used and marketed like late 90s, early 2000s. It was this actually UK distribution company that created and coined this term as a way to kind of market East Asian horror thrillers that were like often very, very violent, like ultra extreme violence, and they were trying to market it towards Western audiences as something that was kind of exoticized and othered as this look at these films that depict violence in such an unusual and unthinkable way. And I think that that like still continues on a little bit. Like we saw with Squid Game, like Netflix, and how they marketed it and how it was received. Graphic violence is just so Korean. Like it's become almost like a focal point of Korean film and other media. And I feel like it's important to like remember that, like how we consume that kind of violence, because there's not one way to depict violence, like obviously, but it's more like your emotional or sort of like moral reaction to it can kind of differ depending on the like cultural context in which you're watching it. So yeah, I always want to like just be mindful of that. Like when you're talking about Korean cinema, I think we touched on this in our Train to Busan episode. That being said, there's like room for criticism. Just because of like how Asia Extreme came about, like unfortunately it was spearheaded by Tarantino. Motherfucker, you son of a bitch. It was very much spearheaded by him. I think he was very much involved in getting Old Boy received at Cannes. Obviously, Tarantino's known for this sort of like very comic booky style of violence that he stole from East Asian films, but whatever. That created its own like style that was very much violence aestheticized. And also like another term that was like very much inseparable from that was like the idea of it being cool, very seamless and smooth and cool. And do you know what I mean? Like that's how it was kind of received. And that became associated also with a lot of this Asia Extreme media that was coming out. And to be honest, like there's so much to say about like how Korean filmmakers like use genre and splice genre and will like incorporate Hollywood genre styles while using their own national cinema. Like that's a whole other conversation. But it does mean that like, and even in this film, I know that one of his directorial inspirations was Fincher, who is like notorious for being extremely cold and clinical in how he depicts anything, not just violence. And I think that like on the other hand, I Saw the Devil does sometimes lean into, because it's an action thriller, that kind of aestheticization of violence through either fight choreography, whether it's the scene in which he's like covered in blood near the end of the film in broad daylight in the streets. He looks almost like this sort of action hero, like the serial killer, like in this sort of, in what I imagine like audiences have like interpreted now as like Tarantino-esque. I think we have to be careful with like, obviously we've talked about the ways in which it has like, I think demonstrates nuance and an emotional sensitivity and awareness to what it's depicting, but also sometimes leans into violence for violence sake. Hey, this fight scene is fucking cool. Like, which it is. That scene in the taxi with this like stabbing and the blood splurting, like it's undeniably an amazing scene. But then you're thinking also like, what is it showing? Like the horror of what it's showing.
I have a fun fact about the taxi cab scene. The director, in an interview for Bloody Disgusting, talked about like how they did that scene. But he said that the interior shots of the cab were shot in a studio, and what they did was they took off the body of the taxi cab, cut off the top of it, and replaced it with panels that were acrylic so that you could see through the taxi to the interior. And then they spun that taxi contraption around, and we had a camera moving back and forth out of frame, in and out, and we had the taxi spinning physically in there as well. Like, for sure, artistry there. And I think he said in this interview as well, they had to do 4 costume changes because of the amount of blood that was produced. They had to wash the clothes on set because they ran out of, like, costume changes, so they had to wash it.
I make a differentiation between action movie violence, horror movie violence. And I think that, like, the speed of things, or even thriller violence, like, the speed of things makes a lot of difference. So that cool car scene is action movie violence. And, like I consider Tarantino action movie violence. Like, it's hand-to-hand combat. Everything happens really quick. Usually the weapons are like knives and swords and guns and things that are like that move really fast. Whereas I think where this is, you know, decidedly a horror are those like slow, torturous body mutilation scenes. And we get those very, very early on. And I think that, you know, we just discussed, you know, in our previous episode about, I guess, violence against women, and where violence against women is sort of a staple of horror. And also, you know, there is no rape scene in this movie. We don't see it on camera, thankfully, but it gets very, very, very close. And that scene to me is like obvious. Like, I think rape scenes, implied rape scenes, almost rape scenes are like unwatchable to me. Like, I find that type of thing, like, I, you know, obviously it happens in a lot of horror movies, but that is always going to be more terrifying than like somebody's guts getting ripped out to me to like see on screen, because like guts ripped out can be very extreme. And so I think this sort of slow burn, torturous kind of violence in this, as we've discussed previously, like there's a type of horror that uses that intentionally, exploitatively, like because we get sort of enjoyment out of it. This type of torture is like peek through your fingers type of torture. Like you're not enjoying it really. Whereas the action parts you do get to enjoy. So I think this movie has like a little bit of both. And those can kind of like the synapses in my brain of like cutting between those types of violence. It's hard for, you know, if it's a man versus a man and both of them are kind of in the wrong, as we've discussed after a certain point, and I don't really know who I'm rooting for, or that at a certain point I'm not rooting for either of them, rather. That like I can enjoy that both of them are sort of getting slashed, because I'm like, oh, we're in a gray area. I can enjoy this because it's no longer like a good guy versus a bad guy type of situation. Whereas when there's like a clear villain who just like has no morality, is delighting in especially violence against women, I never find that those type of kills enjoyable. The types of kills that are enjoyable in horror movies are like of a neutral character or of a villain. And so I think that like that this bounces around between those is where like I can see a good review and a bad review both being true, right? Like not all the violence is exploitative, not all of it is gratuitous, some of it is just fun, some of it is intensely terrifying, as I mentioned. In the revenge plot piece of this, my roommate pointed out that like when a revenge plot is motivated by a woman being killed in movies, and at least in comic book movies, they call it fridging. I think it's like a Green Lantern reference, but that is like a trope that is in action and superhero movies a lot, that like or like John Wick type of situation where like you're avenging a woman, and that is your green light license to enact whatever violence you want because a woman was harmed, someone who was close to you. I don't actually know what to make of those movies. I bring it up now because I didn't realize that this was like a trope of sort of like action flicks. But that's sort of like catch-all, okay, now this guy gets to like, you know, fuck the law. He's like literally the law. He gets to like be this vigilante character. Like that vigilantism motivated by a woman's death, I don't give it the green light. And I think this movie complicates that like license that we give action movies, also because other women are harmed. But then he like puts other women in danger. And I think that also puts it in this like horrible gray area, because like I think what was frustrating to me is like, yes, he shows up on time, but just on time. Like those women are still terrorized by what they've experienced, like regardless of if they get killed or not.
I don't really have anything to add to that. I think that was really well put, Zeba. It was more just about going back to what you're saying, Mila. I totally do see like in a lot of these just sweeping reviews of this film, writing it off as exploitative and like not engaging with what might be some deeper themes, I do think is a kind of dismissive, potentially Western lens. Yeah, so that's like, I definitely think that is problematic. And I think I agree with you, Zeba, in that like what you were saying about how there's just certain violence things that like we still have to be like say critical of like these instances where we do see like women being brutalized, because, and to what purpose and to what end. I think that is like the kind of central aim of our podcast in many ways, but it always is difficult to comment on other societies in places that we don't live, because that's like hard. I guess it's harder to analyze to what purpose it's being done if you're not like situated in like that specific context yourself. So I definitely do think there is a recognition there that should be said. But yeah, there's definitely some violence that I'm like, yeah, it's too disturbing and I find it difficult to watch. It's kind of why it's an interesting debate to like position of like why we can watch horror, but actually action movie violence that you were talking about, Zeba, I do find like what kind of violence is easier to watch. I actually find action movie violence a bit harder for me in terms of like it just stimulates me a lot. So whereas like when it's like slower torture or like whatever horror, like
Lulls me to sleep.
doesn't lull me to sleep. I just don't. I think if there's just like it's just about a genre, right? Like that's the kind of boundary of what you can like deal with. So I feel like the kind of gory slow scenes are not as hard for me to watch as like quick paced stuff. So and then you also have like a lot of violence against women in this film, so that made it just overall quite hard to do. And the whole reason behind the film is that it's quite senseless violence. So I think when you're also watching women be brutalized in like such a senseless way, because that's the comment that the film is making, that's also just hard to watch in any way, no matter the purpose.
I wanted to talk about the cinematography a bit because I think we get some interesting angles in the film, but also I think it's interesting how dark it is. Even in the scenes that are in the daytime, I still feel like the film itself feels like the lighting is very dark, which kind of parallels with the atmosphere in the film. And you kind of don't even see the killer when he first comes up because everything is so dark, and it's just like that glass shattering moment where you suddenly see the glass shatter and realize that he's coming towards her and that something horrible is happening. And for the rest of the film, we're just kind of like surrounded by this sort of somber darkness that just exists. And the only real breaks in that darkness are like the red from all the blood, and then occasionally like a pop of white on the clothes, which like the nurse is wearing white, the schoolgirl is wearing white, his fiance is wearing white. I think her sister was even wearing white. Their house had a lot of white in it and like pale curtains. There was a lot of light being let in. And so like the parallels that they have with the colors and the lighting, I think are really interesting in the way that the tone is set up in the movie and how colors are sort of assigned to characters. Even with Soo-hyun, he is working for NIT, but he's not ever wearing a uniform in the film for like most of his chase. He's just wearing like a black leather jacket and black jeans, and he's sort of like giving off this vibe of like a rebel or someone who has separated himself from something. So I thought that was really interesting in the way that it kind of helps with the characterization of Soo-hyun and even Kyung-chul, that we can see that they're a part of the darkness in the movie. Kyung-chul obviously far more so, because he's a monster. But there's still the vibe that Soo-hyun is sort of joining him in this darkness rather than bringing him out to justice.
I think especially like because it was snowing in that first scene. I think she even says like it's romantic that we're talking in the snow. Like it definitely like establishes a sort of purity to certain characters and certain scenes, and then like obviously like contrast that to the darkness of other characters, and especially as they like they descend further and further into their acts of violence. It's interesting to hear like Zebra, you mentioned action violence and like the difference for you compared to like horror is this sort of like speed in which it's enacted. Like you imagine like it's all very like fast cuts, which is kind of like it's like definitely how I think like violence is aestheticized, is like the speed in which it's like enacted, but also all these sort of fancy inventive camera tricks, kind of like we were talking about with the taxi stab scene. Those things are to, in a sense, elevate the violence, to sort of emphasize it with the camera, which is part of like its aestheticization, which is obviously very commonplace in action and like action thrillers, because you are supposed to be highlighting like the like fighting capabilities often in action, and like that's like the point of it. But then when we're dealing like with these sort of themes, I think it can like complicate them in terms of depicting violence that's not just justified in a simple sort of revenge plot where, like you said, there's just like very clear good guys and bad guys. The same in a slasher, obviously a different kind of psychology there, because why are we enjoying seeing people slashed up? I think some kind of, monkey brain, the thrill of it, the adrenaline of it, obviously different, but same sort of like enjoyment to seeing something quick and stabby and violent. But then, yeah, like you guys have said, there's also like slower moments in this film. And you mentioned, Zeba, I think like the slower torture scenes are like where it veers into horror. And I think that's very like interesting to sort of point out. Like there's a lot of torture in action, like of course. I think that also like torture in terms of like thinking about violence in Korean cinema, like I've seen conversations about Old Boy, like this sort of like post 9/11 type action violence. It's very, very war orientated. So torture is just like at the forefront of that. And that's why so much of it is so like slow and drawn out and like so involved with torture of the body. And yeah, also in the context of like Korean cinema. I read this. It was an essay called War Horror and Anti-Communism from Pie Gold to Rainy Days, which is a chapter in Korean horror cinema. And it's by Mark Morris, who basically goes into like violence in contemporary Korean cinema and how it's, in a sense, has these sort of legacies of war horror from basically like films in the 60s and 70s that were depicting after the Korean War, like the trauma that the country had suffered. Like they were very like ideologically charged. So there was like so much of that on-screen violence was like really contextualized within the Korean War. And like that then fed into later films like contemporary, like Asia Extreme and then New Korean cinema, like all of those violent films. Like he also cites I Saw the Devil, this sort of like leftover war horror in the violence of these films. And I think that's interesting that you just like picked up on that sort of like torturous aspect of them. But I think also explains like a bit of the extreme violence, like why it's in a sense still haunts these films.
I think that's all really interesting and poignant to think about the kind of cultural legacies of this, like of where the violence is coming from. I just wanted to share some more interesting director quotes because I think they also help like contextualize it, and just in terms of this film rather than society or Korean history. But in an interview with Christopher Bell for IndieWire, Kim Jee-woon talks about how, I'll just read what he says. The basis of this film really starts from asking this question, what would I have done if I was in the same position as a cop character? Because it starts from such an emotional question. If I had been wronged that day, how would I respond? Because it starts from this emotion-based origin point, the film takes on a very emotional core where we see the struggles and dilemmas the main characters are going through from an emotional standpoint, and that's one of the things I was trying to center here. He goes on to say, I think this film is also about pain. This is about one man's pain and returning that in the exact way or maybe more powerfully to the cause of that pain. The audience goes on a similar path. They identify with Soo-hyun. They wish to see that revenge through by the course of the film. I think what really shocked the audience members is not simply actions and emotions of violence that they see, but to see the deep down emotions that drove these actions and to realize that the horrific degree of what is possible as a person. And then he goes on to say that, yeah, he was inspired by Nietzsche's Beyond Good and Evil, hunting a monster, you become a monster yourself. But yeah, and then he addresses like how he's had like accusations of torture porn in this interview as well, like Saw or Hostel. And he says, if you just look at the extreme violence and only focus on those tendencies in the film, it could compare to something like Saw or torture porn. But I hope that the audience see the emotional core that's at the basis of these actions that have driven the central characters to such extremities. They're acting out emotions that are at the core of every person. Because I was trying to explore the extremities of what is possible in humankind, I think it can also be looked at as a psychological thriller, and examining that mindset, I'm hoping that audiences can see both aspects rather than just focusing on one thing or the other. And yeah, I just thought that was really good. And I also think he does in other interviews addresses like characterization points as well. Like there's like, you know, some reviewers, when they said that, like, there's not good characterization, I think in that Electric Sheep interview with Pamela John, he talks about how you do get a sense of, he's not addressing a poor characterization question, but he does mention something which I think then inadvertently addressed those accusations. But he talks about how, like, the director, and this is when he said, like, he talks about the detective's kind of narcissistic pursuit of revenge, but he talks about, like, there's like a campaign there of, like, you know, he works to protect people he loves by his job, and he fails to protect his, you know, loved one from, like, the evil, and that's what kind of really causes this, like, break, you know, for him, and why he goes to such extremes to pursue revenge. And yeah, he also talks about how we have a few hints at the serial killer's personal history too, through through seeing his family. And I thought these mentions in these interview, like that, those kind of moments were kind of poignant, because I think you kind of get enough of the character without needing anything spelled out. Like the fact that he works in law enforcement, you would think, yeah, he's going to bum extra hard that his wife was murdered. Like there's a kind of really hopeless or helpless irony there. And then the fact that we kind of get to, we see the serial killer's, you know, family come in at the end, and you kind of can see what might be conceived as guilt or shame or something that flashes across his face at the very end. Or maybe, as you said, Mila, he's just kind of aware of his own death. But either way, you do get to see through, like, these moments. You get to know about the characters. I think the final shot of Soon-hyun crying, because I think he realizes that, my interpretation is that, you know, what revenge is empty as a feeling, and it just leaves you with all the wrongs that you committed in your pursuit of it. But yeah, I think through all of this, you get to know the characters in a really, like, intimate way. So it's not just an empty violent film.
I think also people have like a morbid fascination with the psychology behind serial killers. So when a film doesn't actually prioritize that, I think they're sort of like, what's the point? Like, in a way, if you explain why someone is so evil, then in a sense, there's some kind of rationale behind it. But if you're like withheld that, it to them seems purposeless or gratuitous, because you're like, you are simply portraying evil. But it's like, then you miss the emotional depth of the film. Like, it's not about why he kills. Like, we're looking at like particularly like revenge and this character's like descent into evil in order to like commit justified violence, but then it, like, you know, shows how that is not how it concludes, basically.
Thank you for listening to the Monstrous Feminine Podcast, produced and hosted by Zeba Aurora, Tyia Burnett, Mila F., and Louisa Johnson. Big thanks also go to Sebastian Pizarro for our wonderful theme music. Be sure to follow us on Instagram, SoundCloud, and Spotify at The Monstrous Feminine Podcast, and on Twitter at The MonFemPod. Subscribe to our YouTube channel and Substack, rate and review us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify, and follow us on TikTok at The Monstrous Feminine Pod for podcast clips and more fun. All information can be found on our website, www.themonstrousfemininepodcast.com. We hope you enjoyed this episode. Brooms up, witches out.